Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. So I work as a relocation assistant, basically helping families move across the country when they get transferred for work. It's decent money, and I get to travel, though the hotels aren't always 5-star. Last October, I was in Phoenix helping the Morrison family settle into their new place after his company moved him from Detroit. The whole process usually takes about a week, finding schools for the kids, getting utilities sorted, that kind of thing. I'd booked myself into this budget hotel called the Desert Palms Inn, on the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy, but it was clean enough and close to where the family was staying temporarily. The first night went fine. Room 237 on the second floor, overlooking the parking lot. The carpet was this awful burgundy color with gold patterns. You know the type, probably installed sometime in the 90s and never replaced. The walls had that generic hotel art, and the whole place smelled faintly of industrial cleaner, mixed with something I couldn't quite place. I'd stayed in worse places, so I didn't think much of it. Just unpacked my stuff, ordered takeout, and called it a night. The Morrisons had scheduled a school tour for their youngest the next morning, so I needed to be up early. The second night is when everything started. I'd spent the day running around with Mrs. Morrison, looking at pediatricians and grocery stores, the usual settling in routine. By the time I got back to the hotel around 8 p.m., my feet were killing me. I kicked off my heels, these black pumps I always wear for work, and was heading to the bathroom when the left heel caught on something. At first I thought it was just a loose thread, or maybe the carpet was coming up at the seam. Hotels like this aren't exactly known for their maintenance. But when I knelt down to see what had snagged my shoe, I noticed the corner of the carpet near the window was definitely lifted. Not just loose, lifted, like someone had pulled it up before and tried to press it back down. The adhesive strips underneath looked old and yellowed. Curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed the corner with both hands. The carpet peeled back easier than it should have, making this awful ripping sound as the old glue gave way. What I saw underneath made my stomach lurch in a way I'll never forget. The subfloor underneath was stained with these dark reddish-brown marks that looked like they'd soaked deep into the wood. Not just surface stains, these went down into the grain, spreading out in irregular patterns that reminded me of spilled wine. Except wine doesn't leave that particular color after it dries. The stains covered maybe a 3-foot area, with smaller droplets scattered around the edges like someone had tried to clean up, but missed the outlying spots. I'm not squeamish. I've helped families clean out hoarder houses before, but something about those marks made my skin crawl. The smell I'd noticed when I first checked in was stronger here too, that underlying odor beneath the industrial cleaner. I sat back on my heels, staring at those stains for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes. My brain kept trying to come up with innocent explanations. Maybe someone had spilled paint, or it was water damage from a burst pipe mixing with rust. But deep down, I knew what I was looking at. The pattern was too specific, too concentrated in one area, with those telltale splatter marks around the edges. I'd watched enough crime documentaries to recognize what dried blood looks like when it's been sitting for years. The hotel had just thrown new carpet over it and hoped nobody would notice. I pulled out my phone and took several pictures, making sure to get the full scope of the stained area, as well as some close-ups showing the depth of the discoloration. The flash made the stains look even darker, almost black in some spots. My hands weren't steady. I had to take each photo twice to make sure they came out clear. Then I pressed the carpet back down as best I could, though it wouldn't lay flat anymore since I'd broken the old adhesive. The whole time I kept glancing at the door, half expecting someone to walk in and catch me snooping around. The next morning, I marched down to the front desk with my phone in hand, ready to show the manager what I'd found. The guy behind the counter was maybe 22, with greasy hair and a name tag that said Kyle. When I explained about the carpet coming loose and what was underneath, he barely looked up from his computer screen, said something about how old hotels have all kinds of stains under the flooring. Could be anything from coffee spills to pet accidents from decades ago. When I insisted these looked like bloodstains, he just shrugged and said housekeeping would take a look at it later. The dismissive way he brushed me off made me more determined to figure out what had happened in that room. That evening, I was back in my room feeling frustrated and unsettled. The Morrisons had kept me busy all day with insurance paperwork and utility transfers, but I couldn't stop thinking about those stains. Every time I walked past that corner of the room, I felt this weird tension in my chest. I decided to post the photos on a local Phoenix Facebook group, just asking if anyone knew the history of the Desert Palms Inn. I kept the caption simple. Found some old stains under the carpet in my hotel room. Anyone know if this place has any history I should be aware of? Within an hour, I had dozens of comments ranging from jokes about checking for bed bugs to more serious suggestions about contacting the health department. Most of the responses were typical social media noise, but one comment caught my attention. A woman named Linda Martinez had written, "OMG, is that room 237? My cousin used to work housekeeping there in the early 2000s. She always said that room gave her the creeps. Management made her clean it extra thorough every time, like they were trying to scrub away bad memories." I replied, asking for more details, but Linda never responded. By the time I went to bed that night, the post had been shared over 50 times, and the comments were getting more and more wild. People were throwing around theories about everything from mob hits to domestic violence gone wrong. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing with a call from an unknown local number. The voice on the other end was professional but serious. Detective Amanda Hayes from the Phoenix Police Department. She asked if I was the person who'd posted photos of stains in room 237 at the Desert Palms Inn. When I confirmed it was me, there was this long pause before she said she needed to speak with me in person as soon as possible. Something in her tone made it clear this wasn't a routine follow-up call. She asked me to meet her at a coffee shop down the street from the hotel in 2 hours, and to bring my phone with the original photos. Detective Hayes turned out to be a woman in her early 40s with short gray hair and the kind of tired eyes you see on people who've worked too many difficult cases. She ordered a black coffee and got straight to the point. Room 237 had been the scene of a double homicide back in March 2003. A young couple named Jennifer Walsh and Michael Chen who'd been staying there for a weekend getaway. Someone had attacked them in the early hours of the morning, and both had died from multiple stab wounds. The case had never been solved, despite years of investigation and several suspects. What made my discovery significant was that the crime scene photos from 2003 showed the exact same stain pattern I'd photographed under the carpet. The detective explained that after the investigation wrapped up, the hotel had supposedly done a complete renovation of the room, including replacing all the flooring. Clearly, they'd just thrown new carpet over the old subfloor without proper remediation. She showed me some of the original crime scene photos on her tablet. The similarities were undeniable. The main concentration of stains, the scattered droplets, even a distinctive elongated mark near what would have been the foot of the bed, it all matched perfectly. Detective Hayes said my photos were actually clearer than some of the evidence shots they'd taken 22 years ago, since the stains had been photographed fresh back then, with all the other blood evidence cluttering the scene. She asked me to keep the photos and my discovery quiet while they decided how to proceed. Apparently, there had been some renewed interest in the case recently, new DNA testing methods, and a few tips that had come in after a podcast covered the murders last year. My find could potentially help them reopen the investigation properly, maybe even convince a judge to issue new search warrants for areas of the room that hadn't been thoroughly examined the first time around. I agreed to cooperate, but I also told her I wanted to change hotels immediately. Something about sleeping in the same room where two people had been brutally killed was more than I could handle, especially now that I knew the exact details. The problem started that same evening after I'd moved to a Holiday Inn across town. I was helping Mrs. Morrison organize her kitchen when I got the first message on Facebook. No profile picture. Obviously fake name. Truth Seeker 47. Telling me I should mind my own business and delete those photos before I stirred up things better left buried. At first I thought it was just some internet troll who'd seen my original post, but the message felt different. Too specific, too personal. Then another one came through an hour later from a different fake account. This one saying I didn't understand what I was messing with and that some secrets were meant to stay hidden. By the time I finished with the Morrisons and got back to my new hotel room, I had 6 more messages from various anonymous accounts. They were all variations on the same theme, warnings to take down the photos and forget what I'd found. The last one was the most unsettling. Jennifer and Michael thought they were safe too. Phoenix has a long memory and some people don't like being reminded of old mistakes. I screenshot every message and forwarded them to Detective Hayes immediately. She called me back within 20 minutes, her voice tighter than it had been during our coffee meeting. She said she was putting a patrol car in the hotel parking lot for the next few nights, and that I should call 911 if I received any more threats. The investigation was definitely being reopened, and someone was clearly not happy about it. People always told me retirement would be boring, but nobody warned me it might be dangerous. At 62, after 30 years with the Dallas PD, I thought the most excitement I'd face would be deciding between cable channels. That changed during a miserable February, when I ended up at the Lone Star Motor Lodge in some forgotten corner of East Texas, recovering from knee replacement surgery that went sideways. My daughter Sarah insisted I couldn't stay alone in my apartment, but she lived in California and couldn't take time off work. The cheapest extended stay option we found was this place, a relic from the 70s with faded turquoise paint and a neon sign that only half worked. The owner, a gruff man named Pete, gave me a monthly rate that wouldn't completely drain my pension. What I didn't expect was how quickly the place would remind me why I'd spent 3 decades solving puzzles other people wanted to ignore. The Lone Star sat on a stretch of Highway 59, where nothing much happened except truck drivers grabbing coffee and the occasional family stopping for a night between somewhere and nowhere else. My room was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the parking lot and a diner that served breakfast until noon. The place had maybe 20 units, half of them empty most of the time. The carpet was that industrial brown that hides stains, and the air conditioning unit sounded like it was dying a slow death. But it was clean enough, and Pete kept the place secure with cameras in the parking lot and decent locks on the doors. After the first week, I'd settled into a routine: physical therapy exercises in the morning, reading mystery novels in the afternoon, and watching the evening news while eating takeout from the diner. The pain medication made everything feel slightly surreal, like I was watching my life happen to someone else. The housekeeper was a small woman named Elena, who couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair always pulled back in a tight bun, and these enormous brown eyes that seemed to take in everything. She had a soft Mexican accent, and a way of moving through the hallways like she was trying not to disturb the air itself. Elena cleaned my room every other day, always knocking softly and waiting for permission before entering. She was thorough but quick, replacing towels and straightening things without making conversation beyond polite greetings. What struck me first was how she never looked directly at anyone. Not at me, not at Pete, not at the other guests. In my experience, people who avoid eye contact are either extremely shy or extremely afraid. Elena didn't strike me as the shy type. The room next to mine, 237, had been empty for my first 2 weeks at the motel. Then one night in late February, I heard voices through the thin walls. Not unusual, except these voices were speaking Spanish in urgent, hushed tones that carried the kind of tension I'd learned to recognize during my years working cases. The conversation went on for about an hour, with what sounded like at least 3 different people, maybe more. One voice was clearly a woman, crying softly between words I couldn't make out. Another was a man speaking in sharp, commanding bursts. The third was harder to identify, but the tone was pleading, desperate. When I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to catch more details, everything went silent. The next morning, Elena arrived to clean my room earlier than usual, and when I asked casually about the guest next door, her face went completely blank. "I don't know nothing about that room," she said, but her voice trembled when she said it. The pattern became clear over the next few days. Room 237 would be silent during daylight hours, but voices would emerge after 10 p.m. Always different combinations of people speaking Spanish in those same urgent, frightened tones. I started keeping a notebook, jotting down times and what little I could make out through the walls. Tuesday night, I heard what sounded like instructions being given, something about tomorrow and the truck. Wednesday brought the sound of someone sobbing, muffled like they had their face pressed into a pillow. Thursday night was the worst. A woman's voice, high and panicked, saying no over and over again in English, followed by a man's voice saying something harsh in Spanish that made her go quiet. My detective instincts, dormant for months, started firing on all cylinders. This wasn't just unusual. This was wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. Elena's behavior grew stranger as the week progressed. She started cleaning my room at odd hours, sometimes as early as 7 in the morning or as late as 6 in the evening. When she worked, she moved with nervous energy, constantly glancing toward the door and jumping at every small sound. One afternoon, I caught her in the hallway outside room 237, just standing there with her cleaning cart, staring at the door like she was trying to see through it. When she noticed me watching, she practically ran to the elevator. That evening, I saw her in the parking lot talking to a heavy-set man in a pickup truck with Nevada plates. Their conversation was heated, with Elena shaking her head repeatedly while the man pointed toward the second floor. When I moved to get a better look, the man spotted me and climbed back into his truck, driving off fast enough to kick up gravel. Pete's explanation for the activity in 237 didn't add up either. When I asked him directly about the guests, he claimed it was a family passing through, staying for a few weeks while they looked for permanent housing. But families don't whisper in the dark like conspirators, and they don't have different voices every night. Plus, I'd been watching the parking lot from my window, and I never saw the same car parked outside the building twice. Different vehicles arrived after dark, beat-up sedans, work vans, sometimes that pickup truck. But they never stayed long. People would go upstairs for an hour or two, then leave. No luggage, no signs of anyone actually living in that room. The whole setup screamed temporary meeting place, not temporary housing. By the second week of unusual activity, I'd started timing my trips to the ice machine to coincide with the evening arrivals. The people I saw were mostly young, mostly women, and they all had the same look Elena wore. That careful blankness that comes from being afraid to show emotion. They moved in small groups, usually escorted by 1 or 2 men who stayed alert and kept checking their phones. One night, I saw a girl who couldn't have been older than 16, wearing clothes that didn't fit properly and shoes that were falling apart. She looked up at me as she passed, and her eyes held a kind of desperation I'd seen too many times in my career. The man with her noticed the exchange and steered her away quickly, but not before giving me a long, hard stare that carried an unmistakable message: mind your own business. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday night when I heard Elena's voice coming from room 237. She was speaking Spanish, but her tone was different. Not the careful, quiet way she talked during the day, but urgent and pleading. I could make out enough to understand she was arguing with someone, saying something about "no more" and "I can't." A man's voice cut her off, speaking in rapid-fire Spanish that sounded like threats. Then Elena's voice again, higher now, almost crying, "They're just children, please." That's when I knew for certain what I was dealing with. This wasn't smuggling drugs or stolen goods. This was human trafficking, and Elena wasn't just a witness. She was trapped in it, probably being forced to help manage the victims or keep them quiet. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and suddenly every strange interaction made terrible sense. I spent the rest of that night pacing my room, trying to decide what to do. My first instinct was to call the local police, but something held me back. In small towns like this, corruption could run deep. And if the wrong people got tipped off, evidence would disappear and victims would be moved before anyone could help them. Plus, I had no hard proof, just overheard conversations and suspicious behavior. Any decent lawyer could tear apart my observations, especially since I was on pain medication that could affect my credibility. I needed something concrete, something that would force law enforcement to act immediately. That's when I remembered the camera in my phone and started forming a plan that would either save those people or get me killed. The next evening, I positioned myself in the stairwell with a clear view of the parking lot and the entrance to the second floor. Around 11 p.m., 2 vans arrived, windowless white vehicles that screamed commercial use. 6 men got out, along with at least 8 women and what looked like 2 teenage boys. They moved the group quickly toward the building, but I managed to get several clear photos of faces and license plates. More importantly, I caught Elena in the frame, unlocking the door to room 237 while looking absolutely terrified. One of the men put his hand on her shoulder in a way that was clearly meant as a warning, not comfort. As I watched through my phone screen, I saw her flinch away from his touch, and the man smiled in a way that made my stomach turn. That smile told me everything I needed to know about Elena's situation. The final piece fell into place the next morning when I overheard Pete on the phone in the office. I'd gone down to complain about a leaky faucet, but stopped outside his door when I heard him speaking Spanish. His tone was businesslike, discussing the shipment and Thursday pickup. He mentioned a figure, $50,000, and something about the girl who cleans knows too much. My blood ran cold as I realized Pete wasn't just the motel owner. He was running the entire operation. Elena was in immediate danger, and so was I if they suspected I'd figured out what was happening. I had maybe hours before they decided to eliminate loose ends. That's when I made the decision that probably saved multiple lives, including my own. I called my former partner Jake in Dallas, the one person I trusted completely to handle this without tipping off the wrong people. Within 2 hours, he'd coordinated with the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force and the Texas Rangers. I sent him all my photos and recordings, along with detailed notes about the timing of arrivals and departures. The plan was simple. I'd act normal while they positioned teams around the motel. The next scheduled pickup was Thursday night, just 2 days away. Jake told me to stay in my room and let the professionals handle it, but I couldn't abandon Elena. She was the key to everything, and if Pete suspected she'd talked, she'd disappear long before any rescue operation could save her. Wednesday afternoon, I found Elena cleaning the laundry room alone. I approached carefully, speaking in the calm voice I'd used with frightened witnesses for 3 decades. "Elena, I know what's happening in room 237, I said quietly. "I'm a retired police officer, and help is coming tomorrow night, but you need to stay safe until then." Her eyes went wide with terror, and she started shaking her head frantically. No, you don't understand," she whispered. "They kill people who talk. They killed the last girl who tried to help someone escape." That's when she told me the full truth. She wasn't just being forced to help. She was being held as collateral for her younger sister, who was somewhere in the trafficking network. If Elena didn't cooperate, her sister would be killed. Thursday night arrived with a thunderstorm that provided perfect cover for the operation. I watched from my window as unmarked vehicles positioned themselves around the motel. At 10:47 p.m., the white vans arrived right on schedule. This time, there were more victims, at least 12 people, including several who looked like teenagers. As they were herded toward the building, federal agents moved in from all directions. The coordination was flawless. They surrounded the vehicles before anyone could escape and secured the building within minutes. I saw Pete being led away in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence even as they read him his rights. The traffickers tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Elena collapsed in the parking lot when she realized it was over, sobbing with relief as a female agent wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. The investigation revealed that the Lone Star Motor Lodge had been a way station in a trafficking route that stretched from Mexico to major cities across the southern United States. Over 40 victims were rescued that night, and in follow-up operations at other locations. Elena's sister was found alive in Houston and reunited with her family. Pete had been running the operation for 3 years, taking advantage of the motel's location on a major highway and his connections with corrupt officials in 2 counties. The prosecutions that followed sent 15 people to federal prison, including Pete, who got life without parole. Elena testified as a protected witness and was granted asylum, later going to nursing school with help from a victim services organization. As for me, I finally understood why I'd ended up at that particular motel at that particular time. Sometimes retirement doesn't mean stepping away from the job. Sometimes it means the job finds you when people need you most. I work as a pediatric nurse at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and last August I had to attend a conference in Cleveland about new trauma protocols. Being 35 and perpetually single, I've gotten pretty comfortable traveling alone for work stuff. The hospital booked me at one of those mid-tier chain hotels downtown. Nothing fancy, but clean and reasonably priced. You know the type. Beige carpets, generic artwork, and that weird smell that's part industrial cleaner and part something you can't quite identify. I'd stayed in dozens of places just like it over the years. The room was on the 4th floor, corner unit, which I actually liked because it felt more private. I remember thinking how quiet it was compared to my usual spots near the airport. The conference was intense, 3 straight days of lectures about pediatric emergency procedures, so I was looking forward to just crashing in my room each night with room service and Netflix. The first night, Wednesday, I noticed the bathroom vent making this weird rattling sound whenever the air conditioning kicked on. It wasn't loud enough to be truly annoying, just this irregular metallic vibration that would start and stop. I figured it was loose screws or maybe the vent cover wasn't secured properly. These older hotels always have something slightly broken, right? I was exhausted from traveling and the first day of presentations, so I just turned up the TV volume and tried to ignore it. But lying in bed that night, I kept hearing it, this intermittent rattling that seemed to have no pattern. Sometimes it would go for 30 seconds, sometimes just a quick shake. I even got up once around midnight to peer at the vent, but it looked normal from where I was standing. Just a standard white metal grate with those horizontal slats. Nothing seemed obviously wrong with it. Thursday morning, I mentioned it to housekeeping when they came to clean the room. The woman, I think her name was Carmen, was really apologetic and said maintenance would take a look. She even wrote it down on her little notepad, which made me feel like she was actually going to follow through. But when I got back from the conference that evening, nothing had been fixed. If anything, the rattling seemed worse. And that's when I started noticing something else, these tiny flickers of red light coming from the vent area. Just brief flashes like when you catch a reflection off someone's phone screen from across a room. I convinced myself it was probably just the fire alarm sensor, or maybe some kind of motion detector I hadn't noticed before. Hotels have all sorts of safety equipment that guests don't usually pay attention to. I remember standing in the bathroom brushing my teeth and seeing another one of those red flickers in my peripheral vision. When I turned to look directly at the vent, everything appeared normal. The rattling got significantly worse Thursday night. It wasn't just when the AC ran anymore. It was happening randomly, sometimes for minutes at a time. I called the front desk around 11 p.m., and the night manager, this guy named Tony with a thick Cleveland accent, apologized profusely and offered to move me to another room. But I had all my conference material spread out, my clothes unpacked, and honestly, I was too tired to pack everything up again. He promised maintenance would be there first thing in the morning. I asked him about the red lights, and he paused for a second before saying it was probably just the emergency lighting system doing its normal checks. That made sense to me. Hospitals have similar systems that flash periodically. But as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed the flickers were happening more frequently, and they seemed to be coming specifically from behind the vent grate, not from any visible detector or alarm. I stood there for probably 5 minutes just staring at that vent, waiting to see it again. Friday was the last day of the conference, and I was actually relieved because the vent situation was starting to really get under my skin. I'd barely slept Thursday night. Every time that rattling started up, I'd jolt awake. But it was during my morning shower that things took a turn that made my stomach clench with genuine unease. I was shampooing my hair, eyes closed, when I heard what sounded like a soft mechanical whirring coming from directly above me. Not the usual HVAC noise. This was different, more deliberate, like a tiny motor adjusting or focusing. I rinsed the shampoo out as quickly as I could and looked up at the vent. The red light flickered once, twice, then went dark. I stood there dripping wet, staring at those metal slats, and for the first time I started wondering if maybe this wasn't just faulty wiring or building maintenance issues. There was something almost responsive about the timing, like whatever was causing the light knew I was looking. I spent most of Friday distracted during the conference sessions, thinking about that vent. During lunch break, I called my sister Katie back in Cincinnati and told her about the weird hotel room. She's always been the practical one in our family, works in IT security, and she immediately started asking technical questions. "Are you sure it's not just a smoke detector?" she asked. "Those things can malfunction and flash at weird intervals." But when I described the whirring sound and the way the light seemed to respond to my movements, she got quiet. "Laura," she said, "that doesn't sound like any building system I know. Have you actually looked closely at that vent? Like, really examined it?" I promised her I would when I got back to the room. The afternoon sessions dragged on forever. I kept checking my phone, counting down the hours until I could get back and figure out what was going on. When I finally returned to my room around 6 p.m., I was determined to solve this mystery once and for all. I dragged one of the desk chairs into the bathroom and climbed up to get a closer look at the vent. From up close, I could see that some of the screws holding the grate in place were slightly loose, which explained the rattling. But as I was examining the metal slats, trying to peer through them into the ductwork beyond, I saw something that made every muscle in my body tense up. There, maybe 6 inches back from the grate, barely visible in the shadows, was a small circular object with what looked like a lens. It was angled downward, pointed directly at the shower area. I blinked hard, thinking maybe I was imagining things, but when I looked again, it was definitely there. A tiny camera, no bigger than a quarter, with a small red LED that pulsed once while I was staring at it. Like it was acknowledging that I'd finally found it. I climbed down from the chair so fast I nearly fell over. My heart was pounding as I grabbed my phone and started taking pictures of the vent from every angle I could manage. Most of them were too dark to show much detail, but in a few shots you could just make out that circular shape behind the slats. I immediately called the front desk, and when Tony answered, I could barely keep my voice steady. "There's a camera in my bathroom vent," I said, a hidden camera pointing at the shower. There was a long pause before he responded. "Ma'am, that's a very serious accusation." "Are you absolutely certain?" I told him I was standing right there looking at it, and he said he'd send security up immediately along with the maintenance supervisor. While I waited, I took more photos and even tried recording a video, though the lighting made it nearly impossible to capture clear evidence of what I was seeing. Security arrived within 10 minutes. 2 guys in their 50s wearing those generic blue uniforms you see at every hotel chain. The maintenance supervisor, an older black man named Curtis, carried a toolbox and looked genuinely concerned. I showed them the photos on my phone first, pointing out the circular object behind the vent slats. Curtis squinted at the screen and nodded grimly. "Yeah, that definitely doesn't belong there," he said. "Let me get this grate off and we'll see what we're dealing with." He climbed up on the chair I'd used earlier and started unscrewing the vent cover. The rattling I'd been hearing for 3 days was immediately explained. 2 of the 4 screws were barely hanging on. When he pulled the grate away, we could all see it clearly. A small digital camera mounted on an adjustable bracket, with what looked like a wireless transmitter attached. The red LED blinked once as if it knew it had been discovered. Curtis reached in and carefully disconnected it, handing the device down to one of the security guards. "This is way above my pay grade," Curtis said, wiping his hands on his work shirt. "We need to call the police right now." One of the security guards was already on his radio, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone at the front desk. Within minutes, my room was crawling with people. Hotel management, more security, and eventually 2 Cleveland police officers who looked like they'd seen this kind of thing before. Detective Patricia Woods, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, took charge of the scene immediately. She photographed everything, bagged the camera as evidence, and started asking detailed questions about when I'd first noticed the problems. "How long have you been staying here?" she asked. When I told her this was my 3rd night, she exchanged a meaningful look with her partner. "You're not the first person to report this," she said quietly. "We've had 3 other complaints about this hotel in the past 8 months. Detective Woods asked Curtis to show them exactly how someone would access the space behind that vent. He led us out of my room and down the hallway to a supply closet that I'd walked past dozens of times without thinking twice about it. Inside, behind shelves stocked with toilet paper and cleaning supplies, was a narrow panel that looked like part of the wall. Curtis had to move several boxes to access it, and when he pried it open with a screwdriver, we could see a cramped crawl space that ran horizontally behind the bathroom walls. "Someone small could definitely fit through here," Detective Wood said, shining her flashlight into the opening. The beam illuminated what looked like a network of cables and more small devices mounted on brackets. "Jesus Christ," Curtis muttered. "How long has this been going on?" The detective's partner was already calling for additional units and what sounded like a crime scene team. The hotel manager, a nervous woman named Patricia who'd appeared sometime during the chaos, kept apologizing and insisting this was the first they'd heard of any problems. But Detective Woods wasn't buying it. "Ma'am, we have documented reports going back 8 months, she said firmly. "Guests in rooms 412, 438, and 441 have all reported suspicious activity involving bathroom vents." I felt sick when I realized I was staying in room 447, just down the hall from the others. The detective asked me to pack my belongings immediately, explaining that my room was now part of an active crime scene. As I threw my clothes into my suitcase, I kept thinking about all the times I'd showered, changed clothes, or just walked around the room in my underwear over the past 3 days. Someone had been watching everything. The violation felt overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I'd traveled alone for years without ever feeling unsafe, and now I didn't know if I'd ever feel comfortable in a hotel room again. Over the next 2 hours, the police discovered cameras in 7 different rooms on the 4th floor, all accessed through that same crawlspace network. Detective Woods explained that whoever set this up had been planning it for months, maybe longer. The cables ran to a central recording hub hidden in an unused maintenance area between floors. "This is sophisticated stuff," she told me while I sat in the lobby giving my statement. "Professional-grade equipment, wireless transmission, remote access capability. Someone spent serious money putting this together." The most disturbing part was that the hotel's own security cameras had been tampered with, specific angles blocked or redirected to hide whoever was accessing that supply closet. When I asked if they had any suspects, Detective Woods shook her head. "We're looking into current and former employees, contractors, anyone who would have had regular access to the building's infrastructure. But honestly, this could have been going on for over a year without anyone noticing." The hotel moved me to a different property across town for my final night, but I barely slept. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow suspicious. I kept getting up to check the bathroom vent, even though I knew it was ridiculous. Detective Woods had given me her card and promised to keep me updated on the investigation. Unfortunately, cases like this are rarely straightforward, she'd warned me. Even if we identify who did this, proving they actually recorded or distributed footage is complicated. The equipment we found could store weeks of material, but we don't know if it was being transmitted elsewhere or sold. The legal implications were murky too. Apparently, privacy laws vary significantly depending on whether recordings were made, stored, or distributed. I called my sister that night and told her everything. Katie was furious and wanted me to contact a lawyer immediately, But honestly, I just wanted to get home and try to process what had happened. The follow-up investigation dragged on for months. Detective Woods called me twice in September to update me on their progress. They'd interviewed dozens of hotel employees, past and present, but nobody was talking. The equipment had been wiped clean of fingerprints, and the wireless signals led to dead ends, probably routed through multiple networks to hide their origin. "We're treating this as an organized operation," she told me during our last conversation. "Not some lone pervert with a hidden camera. The level of planning and technical expertise suggests multiple people were involved." In November, I received a letter from the hotel's corporate office offering a settlement for any inconvenience or distress I might have experienced. My lawyer, Katie had eventually convinced me to hire one, advised me to accept it rather than pursue a lengthy lawsuit with uncertain outcomes. The amount was substantial enough to feel like an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, even though the hotel never admitted fault. To this day, no arrests have been made in my case. Detective Woods retired last spring, and the new detective assigned to the file seems less invested in pursuing it. I've changed how I travel completely. I always request rooms on the second floor now, and I do a thorough inspection of every bathroom vent, smoke detector, and electrical outlet before unpacking. I carry a small flashlight specifically for checking dark corners and crevices. Most of my colleagues think I'm paranoid, but I don't care. The violation of discovering someone had been watching me shower, sleep, and move around that room still hits me at unexpected moments. Sometimes I wonder how many other hotels have similar setups. How many other travelers have experienced that same creepy feeling I dismissed for 2 nights as just faulty equipment? The Cleveland Police Department still has an open case file somewhere, but I'm not holding my breath for closure. At least I know I'm not crazy, and that the rattling vent was trying to tell me something important all along. "28 years old and driving cross-country for a new job in Portland. I'd been on the road for 3 days straight, when exhaustion finally caught up with me somewhere in rural Virginia. It was late March 2019, and I'd been pushing myself hard to make good time, surviving on gas station coffee and determination. The independent motel I stumbled into around midnight wasn't much to look at. Faded blue paint peeling off wooden siding, a flickering neon sign that read Pine Valley Inn with half the letters dark. The elderly clerk behind the bulletproof glass had deep-set eyes that seemed to follow me as I filled out the registration card, his weathered hand sliding the room key through the slot with deliberate slowness. "Room 237, second floor," he'd said in a gravelly voice that suggested too many years of cigarettes. The building felt like it had been frozen in time since the 1970s, complete with orange shag carpet that squelched slightly under my boots and wood-paneled walls that seemed to absorb what little light the dim hallway fixtures provided. My room was at the far end of the corridor, past a vending machine that hummed ominously and cast strange shadows through its cracked glass front. The key, an actual metal key, not a card, turned with a grinding sound that echoed through the empty hallway. Inside, the room smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial disinfectant, with mismatched furniture that looked like it had been collected from different decades. The bed sagged in the middle, covered by a floral comforter that had seen better days, and the single window looked out onto the parking lot where my Honda sat alone under a streetlight that buzzed and flickered intermittently. I'd planned to shower and crash immediately, but something about the silence felt oppressive. Not the comfortable quiet of an empty building, but the kind of silence that makes you strain your ears, waiting for sounds that shouldn't be there. The walls were thin enough that I could hear every car passing on the interstate about a quarter-mile away, their headlights occasionally sweeping across my window as they took the curve near the motel. I tried the television, but only 2 channels came in clearly, a late-night infomercial and static-filled local news. The showerhead sputtered rusty water for the first few seconds before running clear, and the bathroom mirror had a crack running diagonally across it that split my reflection into 2 misaligned pieces. By the time I finally settled into bed around 1:30 a.m., I was regretting not pushing through to the next town. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the occasional rumble of a truck engine or the distant sound of a train horn. The mattress springs creaked with every movement, and the heating unit under the window cycled on and off, with mechanical groans that seemed louder in the darkness. I'd drift off for what felt like minutes before some small sound would pull me back to consciousness, the building settling, pipes clicking in the walls, or the wind rattling the loose window frame. Around 2:45 a.m., I was lying there staring at the ceiling, counting the water stains and trying to make shapes out of them like clouds, when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps that paused every few feet, as if someone was stopping to listen at each door. The footsteps were accompanied by a faint metallic sound, like keys jingling softly or maybe a door handle being tested. The footsteps stopped directly outside my door. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensing as I listened to what sounded like someone very gently trying the door handle. The metal gave the faintest squeak as it turned, just barely, as if whoever was out there was testing whether it would give way. My heart started hammering against my ribs as I realized I couldn't remember if I'd used the deadbolt or just the regular lock. The handle turned again, more deliberately this time, and I heard the soft click of the mechanism engaging, followed by what sounded like someone pushing very lightly against the door itself. Thank God I'd thrown the security chain, a flimsy thing that probably wouldn't stop a determined person, but at least it was something. The pushing stopped, and for several long seconds there was complete silence, as if whoever was out there was deciding what to do next. Then came the sound that made my skin crawl, a soft scratching at the door, like fingernails dragging across the painted wood. It started near the handle and moved upward, deliberate and slow, stopping just above where the peephole would be. I wanted to look through that little circle of glass, but something primal in my brain screamed that it would be a mistake. Instead, I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as the scratching continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. When it finally stopped, I heard those same measured footsteps moving away from my door, continuing down the hallway toward the other rooms. The footsteps paused again, at what I guessed was the next door down, and I heard the same gentle testing of a handle, followed by that awful scratching sound. Unable to stand it anymore, I slipped out of bed as quietly as possible and crept toward the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was out there when they eventually left the building. The parking lot was empty except for my car and an old pickup truck I hadn't noticed before, rusted white with Mississippi plates and what looked like camping gear in the back. The streetlight continued its erratic flickering, casting everything in intermittent pools of yellow light and deep shadow. I pressed my face to the glass, trying to see the motel's entrance, but the angle was wrong. All I could do was listen as those footsteps methodically worked their way down the hall, testing each door in turn. Some doors received only a brief handle check while others got the full treatment. The turning, the pushing, and that horrible scratching sound that seemed to go on forever. By 3:30 a.m., the hallway had fallen silent again, but I couldn't bring myself to go back to bed. I sat in the room's single chair, positioned so I could see both the door and the window, and waited for dawn. Every small sound made me jump. The ice machine kicking on at the end of the hall, a car door slamming somewhere in the distance, even the digital clock's display changing with its soft electronic beep. Around 4 a.m., I heard what sounded like a door opening and closing somewhere in the building, followed by the distant sound of an engine starting up. Looking out the window, I saw the white pickup truck pulling out of the parking lot, its headlights sweeping across the building before disappearing onto the access road. The driver kept the interior light off, so I couldn't make out any details, but something about the way the truck moved, slowly, almost reluctantly, suggested the person behind the wheel was in no hurry to leave. When the sun finally started creeping over the horizon around 6 a.m., I felt like I'd been holding my breath for hours. The normal sounds of morning began filtering in, birds chirping, distant traffic picking up on the interstate, and somewhere in the building, the rumble of old pipes as someone turned on a shower. I managed to doze fitfully for about an hour before giving up entirely and deciding to check out early. My nerves were shot, and the thought of spending another night in this place made my stomach churn. I packed quickly, shoving everything into my duffel bag without bothering to fold anything properly. The hallway looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, and shabbier than I'd remembered. The orange carpet was even more garish in the morning light, stained with decades of spills and foot traffic, and I could see that several of the room doors had deep scratches around the handles, as if they'd been forced open multiple times over the years. The same elderly clerk was still behind the desk when I went to check out, though he looked like he hadn't moved from that spot all night. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a coffee cup next to his elbow that had a film on top suggesting it had been sitting there for hours. When I mentioned hearing someone in the hallway during the night, his expression didn't change at all, just stared at me with those deep-set eyes like I was speaking a foreign language. "Shouldn't have been nobody on your floor," he said finally, his voice even more gravelly than it had been the night before. "You was the only guest up there. Got a businessman in 104 and a trucker in 115, but second floor was empty except for you." He said it with such certainty that I almost doubted what I'd experienced, but I knew what I'd heard. I pressed him for more information, explaining about the footsteps and the door handle testing, but he just shrugged and said old buildings make strange noises. "Could have been the wind," he suggested, though there hadn't been any wind that I could remember. "Or maybe pipes settling, happens all the time." But something in his eyes told me he knew more than he was letting on. When I asked about the white pickup truck, his face went completely blank, and he suddenly became very interested in shuffling through some papers on his desk. "Don't know nothing about no pickup truck," he muttered, not looking up. "We get all kinds of vehicles through here." I paid my bill, cash only of course, and headed for the door, eager to put some distance between myself and the Pine Valley Inn. But as I was loading my bag into the Honda, I heard raised voices coming from around the side of the building. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked toward the sound, staying close to the building's wall. What I saw made my legs go weak. 2 police officers standing outside room 115, the same room the clerk had mentioned housing a trucker. One officer was talking into his radio, while the other was photographing something inside the doorway. I couldn't see much from my angle, but I caught a glimpse of someone being loaded onto a stretcher. Alive, thankfully, but clearly unconscious. The person appeared to be middle-aged, wearing a flannel shirt, and there was something about the way they were lying so still that suggested whatever had happened wasn't just someone sleeping off too much alcohol. An EMT was checking vitals while another prepared an IV bag, their movements urgent but controlled. I knew I should leave, but something kept me rooted in place as I watched the scene unfold. One of the officers, a tall woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, was interviewing the clerk, who had emerged from the office looking more animated than I'd seen him all morning. From what I could overhear, the trucker had been found by housekeeping around 7 a.m., unconscious on his floor with his door standing wide open. The officer kept asking about other guests, security cameras, and whether anyone had reported suspicious activity. The clerk's answers were short and evasive, but when she asked about the second floor, I heard him say clearly, "Had one guest up there. Young fella driving cross-country. Checked out about an hour ago." That's when I realized I needed to talk to them, despite every instinct telling me to get in my car and drive away as fast as possible. I approached the officers and explained what I'd experienced during the night: the footsteps, the door testing, the scratching sounds, and the white pickup truck leaving around 4 a.m. The female officer, whose nameplate read Sergeant Collins, listened intently and took detailed notes. When I described the methodical way someone had worked down the hallway, testing each door, her expression grew increasingly grim. "The victim's door wasn't forced," she told me. "Lock wasn't engaged, just the handle turned. Whoever did this was looking for unlocked rooms." She asked me to describe the pickup truck in detail, and when I mentioned the Mississippi plates and camping gear, she exchanged a meaningful look with her partner. They'd been tracking a series of similar incidents along the interstate, always at small, independent motels, always targeting solo travelers in unlocked rooms. The EMTs loaded the trucker into their ambulance, and I learned from one of them that the victim would probably be fine. Appeared to have been drugged rather than physically assaulted, though they wouldn't know for sure until blood tests came back. "Lucky you used your deadbolt," Sergeant Collins told me as she handed me her card. "We think this guy's been working this stretch of highway for months, maybe longer. Always hits places without security cameras, always leaves before dawn." She explained that they'd found evidence in other cases suggesting the perpetrator carried some kind of sedative, probably something that could be administered through skin contact or inhalation. The scratching I'd heard at my door might have been him trying to slip something through the gap, or testing whether the door frame was loose enough to manipulate from outside. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Sergeant Collins. They'd caught the guy, a drifter named Bobby Hutchins, who'd been living out of that white pickup truck targeting isolated motels up and down I-95. He'd confessed to over a dozen similar break-ins, always looking for unlocked doors and solo travelers who wouldn't be missed immediately. The scratching sound I'd heard was him using a thin metal tool to test door frames and try to manipulate interior locks. In my case, the security chain had saved me. He couldn't get past it without making noise that might wake other guests. The trucker in room 115 had left his door unlocked while stepping outside for a cigarette around 3 a.m., giving Hutchins the opportunity he'd been waiting for. Sometimes I still think about that night, especially when I'm staying in unfamiliar places. I always use the deadbolt now, always check that security chain twice, and I never, ever leave my door unlocked. Not even for a minute. You know how some places just give you the creeps? The Grand Meridian Hotel in downtown Chicago was one of those places, but after working the night shift there for 3 years, I thought I'd seen everything. Turns out I was dead wrong. What happened with room 712 still haunts me, and I need to tell someone about it because keeping this to myself is driving me insane. The whole nightmare started in February 2021, right in the middle of one of those brutal Chicago winters, where the wind howls through the streets like something alive and angry. I was 26 then, fresh out of college with a hospitality degree that wasn't getting me anywhere fast. The Grand Meridian wasn't exactly the Ritz, but it was decent enough. 12 floors of faded elegance trying to compete with the shinier places downtown. Most nights were pretty routine. Drunk businessmen stumbling through the lobby, the occasional domestic dispute, maybe a noise complaint here and there. But room 7112 was different from the start, and I should have paid attention to the pattern sooner. The first complaint came on a Monday night around 2 a.m. Mrs. Henderson from 714 called down to the front desk, her voice shaky and irritated. She was this elderly woman who'd been staying with us for a week while her apartment got fumigated. Real particular about everything. The type who'd complain if her towels weren't folded exactly right. But that night she sounded genuinely disturbed. "There's some kind of argument happening next door," she whispered into the phone like she was afraid someone might hear her. "A man and woman screaming at each other, and I can hear it through the vents. The woman sounds terrified." I pulled up our system and saw that room 712 was occupied by a businessman named Thomas Wright, checked in alone for a 3-day conference. No mention of any companion. I told Mrs. Henderson I'd send security up to check it out, and dispatched Jimmy, our night security guard who'd been working there since the hotel opened. Jimmy came back 20 minutes later looking confused as hell. He knocked on 712, got no answer, used his master key to peek inside. Room was empty, bed unslept in, no signs of any disturbance. Thomas Wright was nowhere to be found, but his luggage was still there, wallet on the nightstand, laptop plugged in and charging. Jimmy checked with the front cameras and confirmed that Wright had entered the hotel around 6 p.m. but never left. The weirdest part was that Jimmy said he could hear muffled voices coming from somewhere in the walls while he was in the room, but he couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from. When he pressed his ear to the air vent, the sounds stopped completely. We logged the incident and figured maybe Wright had stepped out for a smoke or something and would turn up eventually. Mrs. Henderson called back an hour later saying the arguing had stopped, so we all assumed whatever it was had resolved itself. But Wright never came back to his room that night. The second incident happened exactly 1 week later. Different guest in 714, a young couple from Denver named the Johnsons who were in town for their anniversary. Around 3 a.m. they both called down in a panic, talking over each other about hearing domestic violence coming from 712. The husband, David, was pissed off and demanded we call the police because he swore he heard a woman crying and begging someone to stop hitting her. His wife kept saying she heard furniture being thrown around and glass breaking. Room 712 was supposed to be empty that night according to our records, but I sent Jimmy up anyway just to be thorough. Same exact scenario as before. Room completely empty, no signs of disturbance, everything neat and tidy. But Jimmy mentioned something that made my skin crawl. He said when he stood in the center of the room, he could swear he heard faint sobbing coming from inside the walls, like someone was trapped in the ventilation system. The pattern became impossible to ignore after that. Every single week, whoever stayed in 714 would call down with the exact same complaint. Violent arguments, crying, sounds of someone getting hurt, all coming from room 712. And every time we investigated, the room was either empty or the guest inside had no idea what we were talking about. The sounds always seemed to come through the vents, always between 2 and 4 a.m., and they always stopped the moment security entered 712. What really started freaking me out was how specific the complaints were getting. Guests would describe hearing a woman pleading, "Please don't, I'll be good, I promise," or a man's voice shouting, "You made me do this." One guest even claimed she heard someone being dragged across the floor. The descriptions were so vivid and consistent that I started keeping a notebook, writing down every detail. By May, I had documented 12 separate incidents, all following the exact same pattern. Things escalated in June when a guest actually disappeared. Melissa Torres, a marketing executive from Phoenix, checked into 714 for a 4-night business trip. She called down on her second night with the usual complaint, but this time she was absolutely hysterical. "Someone's being murdered in there," she screamed into the phone. "I can hear her choking, gasping for air. You have to do something." I could hear her sobbing through the receiver, and she kept repeating that the woman next door was calling for help. Jimmy rushed up there immediately, but room 712 was occupied by an elderly man named Harold Brennan, who was fast asleep and completely bewildered when Jimmy woke him up. Brennan insisted he hadn't heard anything unusual and had been sleeping soundly for hours. Melissa demanded to be moved to a different room, so we relocated her to the 5th floor. She seemed calmer after that, even apologized for causing such a scene. But here's the thing. When housekeeping went to clean 714 the next day, Melissa was gone. Her bed was made, her belongings were packed and sitting by the door, but she was nowhere to be found. We checked everywhere. Her car was still in our parking garage. Her credit card hadn't been used since dinner the night before. And the front desk cameras showed her entering the elevator around 11 p.m. but never coming back down. The really disturbing part was that her room key card showed no activity after that 11 p.m. entry, meaning she never left her room, at least not through the door. Hotel management wanted to keep it quiet, so they waited 3 days before filing a missing person report, claiming they thought she might have left with a friend or colleague. The police investigation was thorough, but turned up nothing. Melissa Torres had simply vanished without a trace, like she'd never existed at all. Her company eventually sent someone to collect her belongings, and life at the hotel went back to normal. But I couldn't stop thinking about her terrified voice on the phone, begging us to help the woman in 712. The woman who, according to our records and security checks, didn't exist. That's when I decided to dig deeper into the history of room 712. I'd been working at the Grand Meridian for 3 years, but I'd never bothered to look into the hotel's past beyond the basic stuff they tell you during orientation. The building was constructed in 1967, had gone through several ownership changes, and had been renovated multiple times. but there had to be more to it, especially considering what guests kept hearing through those vents. I started by asking some of the older employees, housekeepers and maintenance staff who'd been there for decades. Most of them just shrugged or gave me weird looks when I brought up room 712. But Dolores from housekeeping finally pulled me aside one afternoon. She was this tough Puerto Rican woman in her 60s who'd been cleaning rooms since the 80s, and she had this look in her eyes like she'd been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. "That room's got history, mijo," she whispered, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "Bad history that management don't want nobody talking about." Dolores told me about a murder that happened in room 712 back in 1989. A woman named Catherine Walsh had been staying there with her boyfriend, some hotshot lawyer from the suburbs who had a reputation for being controlling and violent. According to Dolores, the whole 7th floor heard them fighting that night, screaming, things being thrown, the woman begging and crying. But when hotel security finally got involved, they found Catherine dead in the bathroom, head bashed in with a crystal ashtray. The boyfriend, Richard Cromwell, claimed it was an accident, said she'd slipped and fallen during an argument. His story kept changing, though. First he said she hit her head on the sink, then he said she tripped over the bathroom rug, then he claimed she'd been drinking and lost her balance. The police investigation was a joke because Cromwell had connections throughout the city. His father was some big-shot judge, and he had friends in the prosecutor's office. The whole thing got swept under the rug real quick. Catherine's death was ruled accidental. Cromwell walked away without even a slap on the wrist, and the hotel management paid off her family to keep quiet about the whole incident. But here's what really got to me. Dolores said that ever since Catherine's death, room 712 had been a problem. Not just the usual hotel weirdness, but something darker. Guests would complain about hearing arguments and crying through the vents, just like what I'd been documenting. Sometimes they'd find the bathroom flooded with no explanation, or discover that all the towels had been thrown around the room, even though housekeeping had just cleaned it. One guest claimed she saw a woman's reflection in the bathroom mirror standing behind her, but when she turned around, nobody was there. Another guest woke up to find all the furniture pushed against the door, like someone had been trying to barricade themselves inside. The hotel tried everything, brought in priests to bless the room, had psychics come through, even renovated the entire room 3 times. Nothing worked. The incidents would stop for a few months, then start up again. Management eventually started avoiding booking 712 unless they absolutely had to, and they never put anyone in 714 if they could help it, because that's where the complaints always came from. After talking to Dolores, I knew I had to see the room for myself. I'd been up there dozens of times for security checks, but I'd never really paid attention to the details. So one night when 7112 was empty, I grabbed Jimmy and told him I needed to inspect the room for maintenance issues. The moment we walked in, the temperature dropped about 10 degrees. Not unusual for old hotels with wonky HVAC systems, but this was different. It was like stepping into a freezer. The room looked normal enough, typical hotel setup with outdated furniture, and that generic beige color scheme that screams, trying too hard to be inoffensive. But when I got to the bathroom, my whole body started tingling with this electric feeling, like the air was charged with static. The bathroom had been completely renovated since 1989, but I could still see dark stains around the base of the toilet that looked suspiciously like old bloodstains that hadn't been properly cleaned. Jimmy was getting antsy, kept looking at his watch and asking if we could hurry up. That's when we both heard it, a soft whimpering sound coming from inside the walls, like someone crying very quietly. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, then stopped completely. We both looked at each other and Jimmy was like, "Nope, we're done here," and practically ran out of the room. That experience changed everything for me. I couldn't just keep ignoring what was happening anymore. I started researching Catherine Walsh online, digging through old newspaper archives and police reports that I found through a friend who worked at the Chicago Tribune. The more I learned about her, the angrier I got. Catherine was only 24 when she died, a kindergarten teacher who'd moved to Chicago to start fresh after a bad breakup. She met Richard Cromwell at a charity event. and according to her friends, he seemed charming at first, successful, well-connected, the kind of guy who could show her a good life. But the relationship turned toxic fast. Her sister gave an interview years later saying that Catherine had called her the week before she died, terrified, and wanting to leave Cromwell but afraid of what he might do. She'd tried to break up with him twice before, and both times he'd threatened to ruin her career and her family. The night she died, witnesses in the hotel lobby saw them arguing in the elevator, Cromwell gripping her arm so tight it left bruises. The coroner's report mentioned defensive wounds on her hands and arms, but somehow that detail got overlooked during the investigation. Catherine Walsh died afraid and alone, and the man who killed her never faced justice. I made a decision that probably sounds crazy, but I felt like I owed it to Catherine. I started talking to room 712 when I was alone in there, telling her story out loud, acknowledging what had happened to her. I know how that sounds, but I swear the room felt different when I did it, warmer, less oppressive. I also did something that could have gotten me fired. I started warning guests who were assigned to 7-14. Not directly, because that would have raised red flags with management, but I'd find subtle ways to suggest they might be more comfortable on a different floor. Maybe mention that the 7th floor could be noisy due to HVAC issues. Most people didn't care, but a few took the hint and requested room changes. The complaints from 714 dropped significantly after that, and the few times we did get calls, I made sure to respond quickly and take the guests seriously. I also convinced Jimmy to do more thorough checks of 712, not just quick peeks but actual searches to make sure no one was hiding in there or using it for illegal activities. We never found anything, but I think our increased presence helped somehow. The whole situation finally came to a head in August when Richard Cromwell showed up at the hotel. I recognized him immediately from the old newspaper photos. Older now, graying hair, expensive suit, but still had that smug look like he thought he was untouchable. He wanted to book room 712 specifically, said he had sentimental reasons for staying there. The request made my skin crawl, but I couldn't exactly refuse without explaining why. So I put him in 7-12, but I also made sure to position myself where I could monitor the situation closely. That night around 2 a.m. the fire alarm went off on the 7th floor. When we got up there, smoke was pouring out from under the door of 712. The sprinkler system had activated, and the whole hallway reeked of something burning. We found Cromwell unconscious on the bathroom floor, smoke inhalation and a gash on his forehead, where he'd apparently hit the sink. The weird part was that there was no source for the fire. No burned furniture, no electrical issues, nothing that could have caused smoke. The room was soaked from the sprinklers, but there was no actual fire damage anywhere. Cromwell was hospitalized for 3 days, and when he got out, he checked out immediately without saying a word to anyone. Management wrote it off as a malfunction in the sprinkler system, but I knew better. Catherine had finally gotten her justice. So I've been debating whether to post this for months now, but what happened to me and my girlfriend Emily at the Riverside Inn last September still haunts me. We were both 24 at the time, just graduated college, and finally had enough saved up for a decent weekend getaway. I was working at a tech startup downtown, pulling those typical 60-hour weeks, and Emily was teaching 3rd grade at an elementary school across town. We'd been together for 3 years, and honestly, we desperately needed this break. The stress of our new jobs was wearing us down, and we figured a quiet weekend at this supposedly charming historic hotel would be perfect. The place had great reviews online, talking about its old-world charm and peaceful atmosphere. We booked room 237 on the 2nd floor, specifically requesting something away from the elevators and main hallways because we wanted complete silence. When we arrived that Friday afternoon in late September, the autumn leaves were just starting to turn, and the hotel looked exactly like the photos. This beautiful old brick building with ivy crawling up the walls and tall windows that seemed to watch you as you walked up to the entrance. The check-in process was normal enough, though I remember the desk clerk, this middle-aged guy named Warren with thick glasses and a nervous way of speaking, seemed oddly insistent about our room assignment. When I mentioned we'd specifically requested a quiet room, he kept repeating that 237 was perfect for us, that we'd love the view and the tranquility. He handed over the old-fashioned brass keys with this weird emphasis, like he was relieved to be getting rid of them. Emily and I just shrugged it off. Hotel staff can be eccentric, especially at these older places. The lobby had this musty smell that old buildings get, mixed with furniture polish and something else I couldn't quite identify. There were maybe a dozen other guests scattered around, reading newspapers or chatting quietly, but the place had this strange quality where even normal conversation seemed muffled. We grabbed our bags and headed up the narrow staircase, the old wooden steps creaking under our feet in this rhythmic pattern that would later become sickeningly familiar. Room 237 was at the end of a long hallway, lined with faded floral wallpaper and dim sconce lighting that cast strange shadows between the door frames. The key turned easily in the old lock, and we stepped into what seemed like a perfectly normal hotel room. Queen bed with a burgundy comforter, heavy curtains blocking most of the natural light, and that generic hotel furniture that looks like it hasn't been updated since the 90s. Emily immediately went to open the curtains while I dropped our bags near the dresser. The room had 2 windows facing east toward what the clerk had called the garden view, though all I could see were overgrown bushes and the parking lot beyond. What struck me immediately was how quiet it was, not the peaceful kind of quiet we'd hoped for, but this oppressive silence that made you want to whisper. Even when Emily was moving around unpacking, her footsteps seemed muted, like the room was absorbing sound. We didn't think much of it at first, just chalked it up to good insulation in an old building. We spent the evening exploring the nearby downtown area, had dinner at this little Italian place, and came back around 10 p.m. ready to crash and enjoy our first full day tomorrow. The first night, we both slept like rocks. Emily had brought some melatonin because she's always been a light sleeper, and I was exhausted from the work week anyway. We woke up Saturday morning feeling refreshed and ready to explore. We had breakfast at the hotel's restaurant, nothing fancy but decent enough, and spent the day hiking at a nearby state park. Emily loves photography, so she was constantly stopping to take pictures of the fall foliage and old stone walls along the trails. I remember thinking how perfect everything was going, how we'd finally found a place where we could truly disconnect from all the stress back home. The day was crisp and clear, one of those perfect autumn days where the air smells like leaves and wood smoke. We even talked about maybe coming back to this area for a longer vacation sometime. When we returned to the hotel that evening around 8 p.m., we were tired but happy, planning to grab some room service and watch a movie before bed. Warren was still at the front desk, and he asked us how our day went with that same nervous energy, nodding a bit too enthusiastically when we said we'd had a great time. We grabbed our key and headed back up to room 237, completely unprepared for what was about to start. It started around 11:30 p.m. that Saturday night. We'd ordered room service, just some sandwiches and fries, and were halfway through a Netflix movie when the first bang came from the wall behind our headboard. It was loud, like someone had taken a sledgehammer to the other side of the wall. Emily and I both jumped, and she immediately grabbed the remote to pause the movie. We sat there in complete silence, waiting to see if it would happen again. About 30 seconds later, another bang just as loud, followed by what sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Then silence again. Emily looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before. Not quite fear, but definitely concern mixed with confusion. "Maybe they're moving furniture?" she whispered, though even as she said it, we both knew that didn't make sense. Who moves furniture at 11:30 at night in a hotel? The banging continued sporadically for about 20 minutes, sometimes single hits, sometimes 3 or 4 in rapid succession, always coming from that same spot behind our bed. Each impact was so forceful that our headboard actually vibrated against the wall. By midnight, we'd had enough. Emily was visibly shaken. She's always been sensitive to noise, which is why we'd specifically requested a quiet room in the first place. I called the front desk and Warren answered on the first ring, like he'd been sitting there waiting. When I explained about the noise, there was this long pause before he said, "I'm sorry about that, sir. I'll look into it right away." His voice had this strained quality, like he was trying too hard to sound calm. But here's the thing. The banging stopped the moment I hung up the phone. Complete silence. We waited another hour, but nothing. Emily finally relaxed enough to try to sleep, though she kept the TV on low for background noise. I stayed awake much longer, listening, but the rest of the night was peaceful. The next morning, we both convinced ourselves it had been a one-time thing. Maybe maintenance work that had run late. We didn't even mention it when we saw Warren at breakfast. He seemed back to his normal nervous self, asking about our plans for the day with that same forced enthusiasm. Sunday was another beautiful day, so we drove to a nearby lake and rented a kayak. Emily loves being on the water. It's one of her favorite ways to decompress, and we spent hours just paddling around, talking about everything except the previous night's disturbance. The lake was surrounded by these gorgeous hills covered in red and gold maples, and Emily took probably 50 photos. We had lunch at this little diner in town where the waitress knew everyone's name and the pie was homemade. For a few hours, I forgot all about the banging and just enjoyed being with Emily in this peaceful setting. We even talked about maybe extending our stay an extra day, since we both had Monday off anyway. But as the sun started to set and we headed back to the hotel, I noticed Emily getting quieter, more tense. She kept checking her phone and adjusting the radio volume, like she was trying to avoid thinking about something. When we pulled into the hotel parking lot around 7 p.m., she actually hesitated before getting out of the car. "Maybe we should just drive home tonight," she said quietly. But we'd already paid for 2 nights, and honestly, I was hoping the previous night had been a fluke. The banging started even earlier on Sunday night, around 10:15 p.m., just as we were getting ready for bed. This time it was different, more aggressive, more persistent. Instead of sporadic hits, it was a steady rhythm. Bang, 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 pause, then 3 more hits. It went on for 10 minutes straight without stopping. Emily was sitting on the edge of the bed, completely rigid, her eyes wide and fixed on the wall. "This isn't normal," she kept saying. "This isn't normal." The sound was so intense that the pictures on our wall were actually shifting, and I could see dust falling from the ceiling where it met the wall. I grabbed my phone and called the front desk again, but this time it rang and rang with no answer. Meanwhile, the banging continued, now accompanied by what sounded like scratching or scraping against the wall surface. Emily started crying, not sobbing, just these quiet tears running down her face while she stared at that wall like she expected something to break through it. I'd never seen her so terrified, and that scared me more than the noise itself. When I finally got through to the front desk after about 15 minutes, a different voice answered, a woman who sounded much older than Warren. I explained the situation, trying to keep my voice steady while the banging continued in the background. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson, the night manager, listened quietly before saying, "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Collins. Unfortunately, we're completely booked tonight, so I can't offer you a different room." I could hear Emily whimpering behind me as another series of impacts shook our headboard. "Look," I said, my patience wearing thin, "this is completely unacceptable. We paid for a quiet room, and whatever's happening next door needs to stop right now." Mrs. Patterson's response chilled me. "I understand your frustration, sir, but I'm afraid there's nothing I can do about the adjacent room tonight. Perhaps things will be quieter tomorrow." The way she said adjacent room was strange, like she was being deliberately vague. I demanded to speak to whoever was in charge of the room next door, but she insisted that wasn't possible. The banging suddenly stopped mid-conversation, and in the silence that followed, I could hear Mrs. Patterson breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "I'll make a note in your file," she said finally, and hung up before I could respond. Emily and I spent the rest of the night in the lobby. We grabbed our pillows and a blanket, and camped out on one of those big leather couches near the fireplace. The night security guard, an elderly man named Frank, didn't seem surprised to see us there. He just nodded when I explained about the noise and said, "Sometimes the old building settles funny at night." But there was something in his eyes, a knowing look that suggested he'd seen this before. Emily curled up against me, but she barely slept. Every time the old building made even the smallest sound, a pipe creaking, the elevator humming, she'd tense up. I dozed fitfully, waking up every hour or so to check on her. Around 4 a.m., Frank brought us some coffee and sat with us for a while. He was chatty, telling us stories about the hotel's history, how it used to be a boarding house in the 1920s, then a family residence, before being converted to a hotel in the 1980s. "Lots of history in these old walls," he said with a meaningful look. When I asked him directly about noise complaints, he just shrugged and said, "Some rooms are quieter than others." By morning, we were exhausted, cranky, and ready to demand answers. Warren was back at the front desk Monday morning, and he looked like he hadn't slept either. His glasses were crooked, his hair was disheveled, and he kept glancing toward the staircase like he expected something to come down it. When we approached the desk, he immediately started apologizing before we even said anything. "I'm so sorry about last night," he said, wringing his hands. "I tried to reach the guest in 235, but there was no answer." Emily and I exchanged glances. 235 was the room next to ours. "We want to change rooms," I said firmly. "Today. Right now." Warren's face went pale, and he started typing frantically on his computer. After several minutes, he looked up with this defeated expression and said, "I'm afraid we're still completely booked. There's a big conference in town, and every hotel in the area is full." I didn't buy it for a second. The hotel parking lot was maybe half full, and we'd barely seen a dozen other guests during our entire stay. "Then we want to speak to your manager," Emily said, her voice shaking with anger and exhaustion. Warren promised to have someone call us within the hour, and we went to get breakfast, determined not to spend another night in room 237. But here's where things got really weird. Around noon, I decided to do some investigating on my own. Emily was taking a nap in the lobby. She was completely drained from the sleepless night, so I quietly went back up to the second floor. I walked slowly down the hallway to room 237, then continued past it to where room 235 should be. But there was no room 235. The hallway just ended at our room, with a blank wall where the next door should have been. I stood there for a full minute, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The room numbers went 233, 237, then nothing. I walked back down the hallway, counting doors and checking numbers twice. There was definitely no room 235, and yet the banging had clearly come from that direction. I even pressed my ear to the wall where the room should be, but heard nothing. No sounds of occupancy, no furniture, no footsteps, just silence. The wallpaper was slightly different there too, newer looking, like it had been recently replaced. I took photos with my phone, though I wasn't sure what they would prove. When I got back to the lobby, Emily was awake and talking to Mrs. Patterson, who had apparently come in early to address our complaint. Mrs. Patterson was a thin woman in her 60s with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and these sharp blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. She was apologizing profusely to Emily, explaining that they would do everything possible to make our stay comfortable. When I approached, she turned to me with this practiced smile and said, "Mr. Collins, I understand you've been having some issues with noise from the adjacent room. I want to assure you that we take these complaints very seriously." I immediately told her about my discovery upstairs, that there was no room 235, that the hallway just ended at a blank wall. Her smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, that's an odd mistake in our system," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Let me check our records." She disappeared into the back office for about 10 minutes while Emily and I waited, both of us getting more anxious by the minute. When she returned, she was carrying a clipboard and wearing that same forced smile. "I've spoken with maintenance," she announced. and they've confirmed that the adjacent space is currently sealed off for asbestos removal. It's been empty for several months now. The words hit me like a physical blow. Emily grabbed my arm so hard I could feel her nails through my shirt. "What do you mean, empty?" I asked, though I already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. Mrs. Patterson's composure finally cracked a little, and I could see sweat beading on her forehead despite the lobby's cool temperature. "The space next to your room is under renovation," she said slowly, like she was choosing each word carefully. "There's been no one in there since last spring. The room was damaged in a small fire, and we're waiting for environmental clearance before we can begin repairs." Emily was staring at her with this look of complete horror, and I felt like the floor was tilting under my feet. "So you're telling us," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "that all that banging, all that noise for 2 nights was coming from an empty, sealed room?" Mrs. Patterson just nodded, her eyes not quite meeting ours. "Sometimes old buildings make strange sounds," she said weakly. "Pipes settling, you know." But we all knew that wasn't what this was. The banging had been too deliberate, too rhythmic, too purposeful. Emily started recording on her phone right there in the lobby. "I want this on record," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "We're not crazy, and we're not making this up. Something was in that room, and you know it." Mrs. Patterson looked genuinely panicked now, glancing around the lobby to see if other guests were listening. "Please, let's discuss this privately," she said, gesturing toward the back office. But Emily wasn't having it. "No," she said firmly. "We're checking out right now and we want a full refund. And we want answers about what's really happening in this place." I pulled out my own phone and started recording too, capturing Mrs. Patterson's increasingly frantic attempts to downplay the situation. She kept insisting it was just old building noises, that the renovation area was completely secure, that there was no way anything could be making deliberate sounds. But her story kept changing. First it was asbestos removal, then fire damage, then general renovations. Finally, Warren appeared from behind the front desk, looking like he might be sick. "Just give them the refund," he said quietly to Mrs. Patterson. "Please. Just let them go." We packed our bags in record time and got out of there within an hour. As we were loading the car, Frank the security guard approached us. He looked around nervously, then leaned in close and said, "You folks weren't the first to complain about that room. Won't be the last either." When I asked him what he meant, he just shook his head and walked away. We drove home in mostly silence, both of us trying to process what had happened. Emily kept checking her phone, reviewing the audio recordings she'd made of our conversation with Mrs. Patterson. When we got home, she immediately started researching the hotel online, looking for other reviews that mentioned strange noises or disturbances. What she found was disturbing. At least a dozen reviews over the past 2 years mentioning unexplained banging, scratching, and other sounds, almost all from guests who had stayed in room 237. The hotel's responses to these reviews were always the same: apologetic but vague, blaming old building sounds or nearby construction. We never did get a satisfactory explanation for what happened to us that weekend. The hotel issued us a full refund within a week, but they never followed up or provided any real answers about the sealed room or the source of the disturbances. Emily and I are still together, but we've never been able to forget those 2 nights. Sometimes when we're lying in bed at night and the house is completely quiet, we'll hear a small sound, a pipe settling, the refrigerator cycling on, and we'll both tense up, remembering that rhythm of deliberate banging that came from a room that didn't exist. "20 years old and broke as hell. That's how I ended up at the Riverside Inn during my junior year at State. November 2022, and I was there for a 3-day debate tournament that could make or break my scholarship chances. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. Peeling wallpaper in the lobby, carpet that squished under your feet like it was permanently damp. Behind the front desk stood this gaunt guy with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed too big for his face. His name tag read Norman, and he had this nervous habit of tapping his pen against the counter in rapid bursts of 3. When I asked about the Wi-Fi password, he just stared at me for a solid 10 seconds before scribbling it on a scrap of paper. His handwriting looked like chicken scratches, and I had to squint to make out Riverside 123. The whole interaction felt off-kilter, like he was operating on a different frequency than the rest of us. Room 237 was at the end of a long, narrow hallway that seemed to stretch forever under the dim overhead lighting. The carpet here was a different color than downstairs, a sickly green that reminded me of hospital scrubs. As I walked, I noticed several doors had out-of-order signs taped to them, and one had what looked like water damage stains creeping down from the ceiling. The air conditioning unit hummed loudly, but it wasn't actually cool, just this stale, recycled air that tasted metallic on my tongue. When I finally reached my room, the key card took 4 tries to work, and the door itself stuck like the frame was warped. Inside wasn't much better. A queen bed with a comforter that had seen better decades, a small desk bolted to the wall, and a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. The worst part was the smell. Not exactly mold, not exactly decay, but something organic and wrong that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. I opened the single window, hoping for fresh air, but it only opened about 3 inches, and the screen was torn. Outside, I could see the parking lot, and beyond that, a stretch of abandoned buildings that used to be a shopping center. The tournament materials were scattered across my bed. Case files, research notes, argument outlines I'd been perfecting for months. Everything I'd worked toward was riding on the next 3 days, so I tried to focus on prep work instead of the creeping unease that had settled in my chest. The desk lamp cast this harsh white light that made everything look washed out and sickly. Around 11 p.m. I was deep into reviewing my rebuttals when I heard it for the first time. A voice, muffled but distinct, coming from the wall behind the headboard. At first I thought maybe it was the TV from the room next door, but as I listened closer, I realized it was someone speaking in a low, urgent whisper. The words were hard to make out through the thin walls, but the tone was unmistakable. Fear, desperation, like someone pleading. I pressed my ear against the cool paint and held my breath, straining to hear. The voice seemed to be coming from room 238, right next to mine, and whoever was speaking sounded like they were in serious trouble. The whisper stopped abruptly, leaving only the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, ear still pressed to the wall, waiting for it to start again. When it didn't, I convinced myself I was just stressed about the tournament, maybe hearing things that weren't there. But then, around midnight, it came back, clearer this time. Please don't let them in. The words were so distinct I could have sworn the person was standing right next to me. My heart started pounding as I realized someone was in genuine distress just a few feet away from where I was sitting. The voice sounded young, maybe even younger than me, and there was this raw terror in it that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my phone to call the front desk, but then hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if it really was just a TV or someone on a phone call? I decided to check it out myself first. The hallway was even creepier at night, with only every third light bulb working, and shadows pooling in the corners like spilled ink. My bare feet were silent on the damp carpet as I made my way to room 238. The door looked identical to mine. Same fake wood grain, same peephole, same electronic lock. But when I got closer, I noticed something weird. There was no light seeping from under the door, no sounds of movement or television. The silence was so complete it felt oppressive, like the room was absorbing sound rather than producing it. I raised my hand to knock, then paused. What was I even going to say? "Hey, I heard you begging for help through the wall?" That sounded insane, even to me. But the memory of that terrified voice pushed me forward. I knocked softly at first, 3 gentle taps that seemed to echo down the empty hallway. No response. I tried again, a little louder this time, and called out quietly, "Hey, everything okay in there?" Still nothing. The silence stretched on, broken only by the building's various mechanical sounds. pipe settling, the elevator shaft groaning, the ice machine churning at the far end of the hall. I pressed my ear to the door, hoping to hear something, anything, that would confirm someone was inside. But there was nothing, not even the sound of breathing or movement. It was like the room was completely empty, which made no sense given what I'd heard just minutes before. I knocked one more time, harder now, and waited. When no one answered, I reluctantly headed back to my room, but I left my door cracked open just enough to listen for any more sounds from next door. Sleep was impossible after that. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, every nerve ending on high alert, waiting for the voice to return. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed red in the darkness. 1:47 a.m., then 2:23 a.m., then 3:15 a.m. Each minute crawled by like an hour. Around 3:30 I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, stopping right outside my door. I held my breath, wondering if whoever was out there could see the thin strip of light under my door. The footsteps lingered for what felt like forever, then continued down the hall. I waited another 10 minutes before creeping to the peephole, but the hallway was empty again. The whole building seemed to be holding its breath, like it was waiting for something terrible to happen. Even the air conditioning had gone quiet, leaving only the sound of my own rapid heartbeat echoing in my ears. At 4:17 a.m., the voice came back, and this time it was different, more urgent, more desperate. "Please don't let them in. They're trying to get in. Please, someone help me." The words were so clear it was like the person was speaking directly into my ear. I shot upright in bed, adrenaline coursing through my system. This wasn't my imagination. Someone was genuinely in trouble next door. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but as soon as the operator answered, I realized how crazy I would sound. "Hi, I'm hearing voices through a hotel wall." They'd probably think I was having a mental breakdown. Instead, I hung up and called the front desk. The phone rang and rang, but no one picked up. Norman must have been asleep or stepped away. I tried 3 more times with the same result. Just endless ringing echoing through the empty lobby below. I couldn't just lie there and do nothing while someone was begging for help. I threw on some clothes and headed downstairs to find Norman, or whoever was working the night shift. The lobby was eerily quiet, lit only by the glow of the vending machines and the dim security lighting. The front desk was empty, but I could see a coffee mug still steaming behind the counter, so someone had to be around. I called out, "Hello?" several times, but got no response. There was a door marked "Staff Only" behind the desk, so I walked around and knocked on it. After a moment, Norman appeared, looking even more disheveled than before. His hair was sticking up in odd directions, and he had this dazed look in his eyes like I'd just woken him from a deep sleep. When I started explaining about the voice from room 238, his expression changed completely. The color drained from his face and he started shaking his head before I even finished talking. "No, no, no," he kept muttering, backing away from me like I was contagious. "Room 238 is locked. Has been for months. Water damage from the pipe burst last winter." He was wringing his hands now and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the lobby being freezing cold. "Nobody's been in there since March. We sealed it off because of the mold." But I knew what I'd heard. That voice was real. Those pleas for help were genuine. I pressed him for details, asking why the room wasn't properly marked as out of order like the others, why there were no warning signs on the door. Norman just kept shaking his head, mumbling about how the room was supposed to be empty, how it had to be empty. His behavior was making my skin crawl. There was genuine fear in his eyes, like he knew exactly what I was talking about, but couldn't bring himself to admit it. He insisted on walking back upstairs with me, clutching a massive ring of keys that jangled with every step. The elevator ride felt eternal, filled only with his nervous breathing and the mechanical groaning of the ancient lift. When we reached the second floor, Norman moved down the hallway like he was walking to his own execution. At room 238, he fumbled with the keys for what felt like forever, trying several before finding the right one. "See?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper as he turned the key. "Empty. Been empty for months." The door swung open to reveal complete darkness, and the smell that hit us was overwhelming. Not just mold, but something deeper, more organic. Norman fumbled for a light switch, and when the single overhead bulb flickered on, I saw why he'd been so terrified. The room was destroyed, ceiling tiles hanging down, black mold covering entire walls, furniture stacked haphazardly in the center like someone had tried to barricade themselves in. But that wasn't the worst part. On the wall that connected to my room, someone had scratched words into the plaster with their fingernails. Desperate, jagged letters that spelled out, "Help me," and "Don't let them in," over and over again. The scratches were deep, like whoever made them had clawed at the wall until their fingers bled. Norman saw me staring at the wall and quickly flicked off the light, ushering me out of the room. "Water damage," he repeated frantically as he locked the door behind us. "Just water damage. Sometimes the pipes make noises that sound like voices. Old building, you know?" But his explanation fell apart when I noticed his hands trembling as he pocketed the keys. We walked back to my room in complete silence, and I could feel him watching me as I closed my door. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the chair by the window, afraid to go near the wall, afraid to sleep, afraid of what else I might hear before morning came.